Well, good morning, Momentum. So glad and so privileged to be here with you in the house this morning. And those of you who are joining us on MoTV, thank you so much for joining us this morning. I pray that our experience, our worship experience this morning, will just continue to glorify God. Thank you, Pastor Dan, for just being amazing. It is such a privilege to be to take your mantle and be here in your position this morning. So this morning, we are talking week 2 in the series on the F-bomb, okay? And so Pastor Dan told you last week what it is not, so I don't have to do all that. But this morning, I would hope and share with you that you would allow me to share my story with you this morning. I've walked through a major trial in forgiveness, and so this morning, I pray that you would let me share that with you this morning. So I want to start off by telling you a story. I grew up in Detroit, which is not too far down the lake, somewhere down over that part over there, yeah. I grew up in Detroit. So I know a story about a young man who for most of his life he didn't know his father. And he was coming around his teenage years, little young adolescent years, about 12, 13 years old. And he was so excited because for the first time in his life, he was going to have the opportunity to meet his father. Could you just imagine? Like, you get to meet your father for the very first time. Like, some people, they grow up with their father all their lives, but this young man right here, for the first time in his life, he was so excited because he got to meet his father. So, all the week, he was so excited, packing up his stuff, getting ready his stuff for the weekend. So he packed his little duffel bag, put all his stuff in it, and he went to the front porch because his dad was going to be picking him up because there were some things between his mom and his dad that didn't sit quite right. So dad was going to be picking the young man up from the front porch. And so the young man got his bag together. He packed his bag, and he went to the front porch, and he waited with bated breath, waiting for his dad to come and get him. For the first time, this kid was going to meet his father. Man, he was so stinking excited about this opportunity. So 6 o'clock rolled around, and his dad didn't come. No big deal. He'll be here. He promised he was going to come. 7 o'clock rolled around. Dad still didn't come. 8 o'clock rolled around. Dad didn't come. 9 o'clock rolled around. Dad didn't come. 10 o'clock rolled around. Kid is still on the front porch, but Dad was nowhere to be found. 11 o'clock rolled around, and Dad didn't come. Maybe there's a glimmer of hope that Dad will come before midnight, but Dad never came. And as a matter of fact, it happened several more times where Dad never showed up. Well, as you can guess, that kid is me. And this is the front porch that I sat there and I waited on 13982 Kentucky Street in Detroit, Michigan. And I waited there on that front porch opposite of the chairs on the top step waiting for my father to come, but he would never show up. And as I began to think about this situation, it's interesting because I really didn't come to grips to this situation actually until about a month and a half ago. I went to Detroit. And I want to share my story as a part of a TV series called The Fight to Forgive. And one of the most riveting moments of my testimony became this story. But to be honest with you, up until that point in time, it is something that I had never, ever dealt with. And as a 12-year-old in the situation, and I'll tell you more about it as we go along, but as a 12-year-old in the midst of a situation with so much brokenness, I learned some lessons while I sat on that porch to midnight, and I was hoping that this morning I would share those with you. Psalm 27:10 tells us that when our father and our mother, or our mother and our father forsake us, God will never leave us, and he will never forsake us. Or when our father and our mother abandon us, God will never leave us, and God will never forsake us. As we can imagine, even if my father and my mother abandon me, the Lord will hold me close. As you can imagine, the kid sitting there on the front porch, waiting with bated breath, waiting with bated anticipation to meet his father for the first time, really to find out who he was. You know, because dads, they do something really significant in our lives. Moms, you are absolutely amazing, but we still need our dad too. They form something special in our life. They teach us to do things that we would normally know how to do. They teach us how to treat our wives with respect. They teach us how maybe to throw a football or to change the oil in the car or to do this or that or the other. There are things that we need our dads for. And that kid you saw on the screen was disappointed, you see, because up until that point, his life hadn't been so good. I grew up in Detroit, Michigan all of my life. And probably around the age of, I don't know, about 5 or 6 or 7, somewhere in there, a little foggy, but around kindergarten, first grade, is when I really began to start to remember a whole lot of stuff that went on in my childhood. I remember we had moved right off of 8 Mile. No, I don't know Eminem. I promise I don't. I don't know him. But we moved right off of 8 Mile. Some cousins had moved in with us. And I thought it was really exciting. Yay, our cousins are moving in with us. It's going to be fun. We're going to play all day. And that's what it's going to be. But you see, these cousins brought something to my house that day that would radically change my life. Those cousins began to take advantage of me when I was in the 1st and 2nd grade. And they began to abuse me. And they began to do things that I can't go into detail with this morning, obviously, but they began to hurt my life from its very core. And I remember being in the 2nd grade, wanting to cry out, behaving in school in such a manner, wanting to cry out and let somebody know what was happening to me. And as I begin to grow older, my cousins are still living in our house, and this is going on. And I remember the words that they spoke to me as they were abusing me, and they said this to me: "Don't tell anyone, because if you do, we're going to hurt your mom." There's people that have heard that before, I'm sure. There are people who have had to walk down that road before, but you see, I didn't really understand what was happening, and so I began to think, not that it was normal, but I just began to think that was my lot in life. My lot in life was to endure whatever people had to throw my way, and so I went along, and my cousins were still living with us, and as I was growing up, we got to the 3rd or 4th grade, and I remember we started going to church, and they took me to a church, and we rode the cheese bus, we used to call it. And as we rode the cheese bus to the church in downtown Detroit, east side of Detroit, as we rode the cheese bus there, one of the workers there on the bus sat next to me, and she befriended me. But what I didn't know is that she was friends with my cousins, and she would do the same thing that they did to me. And so as I'm going to my safe refuge, that is the church, the same thing that happens in my home happened to me on the way to the church. As you can imagine, I was a pretty confused 3rd, 4th, 5th grader, somewhere around there. I was a pretty confused child, but I thought it was normal. People who have been wounded a lot, sometimes we think that pain is normal, that pain in that manner is normal. And so as I continue to grow up, I continue to do my best, and I continue to keep it a secret. I continue not to say anything. And then finally those cousins had moved out of our house, and we had moved to a different place. And I remember I was 12 years old, and I was outside playing in the yard. And there was these 2 ladies who obviously were not from our neighborhood. It was obvious. I don't need to tell you why it was obvious, but they obviously did not live there. I think there's a picture of them too, but they obviously did not live there, okay? And so they were coming down the street, and they had these little flyers, and we thought one of 2 things. Either they're really crazy people or they're Jehovah's Witnesses, okay? If they were Jehovah's Witnesses, you run, you close the blinds, you don't hide, you don't engage, okay? Because ain't nobody got time for that. And so they handed me a little flyer, and it said Now and Laters. And it said, if you come today to church, you get a pack of Now and Laters. Oh, candy? Yeah, I'm going. And so I ran in the house and asked my mom, can I go into the, can I go to church? Yeah, no big deal. Go ahead, go. No permission slip, nothing. I don't know what we was doing back then, nothing. And I went, and that day, for the first time in my life, I began to hear about Jesus. Now, don't get me wrong, I had been to church before. But because of what had happened to me, it had so clouded where I was that I couldn't really hear about Jesus. And so I went as a 12-year-old that day to church, and they started talking about this guy named Jesus and how much he loves us. And I'm starting to think in my mind, oh, he don't know what happened to me. He doesn't know what they've done to me. He doesn't know what has happened in my life to this point. Doesn't he know that I'm a 12-year-old? I don't have a father in my home. I got a mom, and I got a stepdad who's an alcoholic who beats my mom. But that's the only example that I have in my home. How could this Jesus want something to do with somebody like me? So as life began to go on, that day I gave my life to Christ. 2 weeks later, I was baptized, and as I'm walking through all of this, you think that in the midst of all that when you get Jesus, the pain will go away, but the pain got worse. What do you do when the pain of your presence overtakes the possibility of a hopeful future for you? What do you do? You see, my struggle was real. My story was real, and all of these things that I was enduring was real. And I never knew just how much the moment on the porch would affect me actually until a whole lot of years later. I never knew what it would do in my life. I never knew how it would scar me. I never knew how it would change the way that I looked at and saw every man or every person who tried to love me. You see, I was hurt, and I felt like even at the age of 12, and even as I rose into a teenager, I had a right to be hurt. I had a right not to forgive you. I had a right. And I told myself in my mind, I blamed my father because I said to myself, if you were there, those things would have never happened. But the reality of it is this, is that there is an evil world, and whether he was there or not, the possibility could be that those things would have still happened. But in my mind, the trap of unforgiveness, I began to blame my father. And I began to live my life in such a way that everybody was out to hurt me just like he was. And so that's how I began to live my life. And I remember that as I was trying to live my life, and around the 14-year-old age, I found out that my mother was addicted to crack cocaine. And I remember it just like no other, because the night I was there and I was listening to my parents argue as I had done so many times before. But this time I hear my mom begin to cry, and they wake us up, and there she admits on a Saturday night, hey, I have to get help. I'm addicted to crack cocaine. And for 2 years I lived with that secret, and I didn't tell anybody because I was so ashamed. So you can imagine I got all the stuff from my childhood. I got all the things from my father, and now I got the things from my mother, and it feels like everything is weighing against me. But I began to serve God to the best of my ability, and I began to love God, and I began to try to follow him. I began to try to make sense of all this mess. And you know what? Sometimes when you're struggling in unforgiveness, you got to make sense of the mess. And so as I began to make sense of the mess, I grew a little bit older, and I started sensing God's call on my life. But you have to understand something is this: no matter how much your life changes in this building, you still have to go back home to reality, whatever it is. No matter how much you praise God in this building or how much you love one another into this building, that was my reality. No matter how much they took me away to a safe place, I still had to go back to the pain that I was living in. I remember Dr. Carolyn Tennant from North Central University. She came to our church to speak one year, and when she came to speak, she had told me, she goes, Clarence, I don't want to sound weird to you. I don't want this to sound weird to you at all. She goes, but the enemy wants to take you out. And I'm like, it's not something 12-year-old me wanted to hear. And actually, I was a little older at that point. She goes, you know, the enemy wants to take you out. I was actually 15 at the time. The enemy wants to take you out. And I'm like, okay, cool. I don't know what that means, you know. And she said, but God is protecting you. And I never really understood that at the moment. I never really understood. And then a couple months later, I ended up getting sick, and I ended up having cancer and tuberculosis at the same time. And I ended up in the hospital, in ICU, fighting for my life. And then in the midst of me fighting for my life, they put me in this isolation, because they didn't know what was wrong with me. And then my dad shows up in my life that time. And I talk to him as best I can, and I go back and forth with him as best I can, and all these things. So I'm seeing him, but the moment that really caused a wrench in our relationship was the time I finally did get to go and meet my father. I was so happy. I was so excited. And so my mom finally drives me over to his house. And I go to his house, and I'm meeting his wife, and I'm meeting my siblings, and I'm meeting these other people. And then he takes me down the street to meet these other people. And I'm like, why am I meeting these other people? I'm not really sure. But I go down the street, and I meet these other people, and I'm not really sure why I'm meeting them, but it's whatever. And then we go back, and my dad's like, hey, so we're getting ready to go on a family vacation. And I'm like, yes. Okay, because when I was growing up, we from Detroit, Cedar Point was our vacation. That was it, okay? Okay, it's a little costly, so that was vacation. And so I was excited. But then my dad said to me, he goes, oh, I'm sorry, you're not going on vacation. we're going on vacation. And so my entire family that I just met whisked off to vacation while I stayed with the neighbor from down the street after the first time meeting my father. And I didn't understand that because I kept asking God all through my life, God, if you love me, then why does life keep hurting me? Why would you allow me to meet my father, the one thing that I've always wanted to do, and then to find on top of that there's going to be more pain subjected to my life? God, I really don't understand you right now. At that time, I met my father, and they all went on vacation, and I stayed 3 weeks with the lady from down the street who happened to be my dad's girlfriend. I had a lot of pain, and I remember all that pain had brought me into a place of me being a young adult, and I was hurt. I was angry, and I was confused. And my goal in life was to make everybody pay for what my father had done to me. And I didn't say this the first service, but it is very wrong of us to make other people pay for how others have hurt us. I heard a quote once that said, if you don't heal from what cut you, you'll bleed on people who didn't cut you. And so many times I did that. I was just angry, bitter man with no resolve in my life. And I walked through my life with no resolve, and I walked through my life through all of these things, and I walked through my life just trying to figure out, God, if you said you love me, then why do these things keep on hurting me? God, if my dad really loved me, then why didn't he show up when I needed him the most? If my dad really loved me, why wasn't he here? And what began to happen, y'all, is I began to build a house for myself. I began to build a trap for myself. I began to build a fence for myself. You know why? Because if my daddy had hurt me, then everybody who came and tried to get close to me was going to pay for what he did. And that's what unforgiveness is sometimes. You know, forgiveness isn't fair, but neither is unforgiveness. And I remember after I went through all that and I got the call, I went to Bible college. I went to Bible college for free, by the way, praise the Lord. And I got the call to go to Bible college. And I'm there going to Bible college, and I go through my 4 years, and y'all, the whole time, I am a hot, depressed mess. I'm fighting back and forth between anxiety attacks. And all this stuff is going on. I'm having panic attacks. And I didn't know what it was. I didn't know what mental health was back then. And I remember I got my first ministry assignment in northern Missouri, and it had stressed me out so bad that I found myself going to the psychiatrist one day. And I went to the psychiatrist because I had all these issues, and I didn't know what to do. And there was really no resolve there other than meds. And I remember I was on my way back from the psychiatrist in Kansas City, and I stopped at a place called IHOP. Not the pancake place, great pancakes, but that's not what I'm talking about. And I stopped there because they had these prayer rooms on Tuesday, and people were just available to pray with you because I was at the wit's end of my life. I could not do it anymore. I had lived a life at the time, I think I was like 27, 28 at the time, of total unforgiveness. And I had spent so many years holding the people who had hurt me absolutely prisoner. And so I remember walking into the prayer room. I wrote my name down there, and I walk into the prayer room, and everyone's talking, hey, how you doing? Good. How was your week? It was great, blah, 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 blah. And the lady just stands up in the midst of all that. She goes, I'm not trying to be rude, but we're here for a purpose. And I didn't say anything to these people. These people didn't know me. I didn't know them. And she said, but Clarence, until you forgive your father, our prayers are unnecessary at this point. And I'm like, what? Ma'am, I don't even know you. I didn't say anything to you about my father. Hello? But she struck right where I was. And I love that we have a God who's not afraid to get in our business. And she struck right where I was. And I left the International House of Prayer rooms that day ticked off and hungry. I left that day. And I went back and I told God, how could you do this to me? How could you put me, my mind is so messed up. I got all this stuff going on. I got hot flashes, and the last time I checked, a guy wasn't supposed to have hot flashes. I don't know. But I'm having mental breakdowns. All this stuff is happening. And I'm like, God, you brought me to the place, but then it's get turned around on me. How is it fair that I'm going for something totally unrelated? At least I thought. I went for prayer for something totally unrelated, and you turned it around to make it about this. But this is what I've learned, that if you refuse to forgive those who have hurt you, your heavenly Father will also not forgive you. Y'all, that was tough. You know why? Because forgiveness is not fair, but neither is unforgiveness. And so I went that day, and I went home, and I remember it was a Tuesday, and I was getting ready to pray about what I would preach at youth group the next day, and I'm praying, and I felt like God was saying, you need to preach about forgiveness. I'm like, no. But I did anyway, of course. And in the midst of that sermon, started the process where I began to forgive my father. And that was in 2010. That was 12 years ago. That was in 2010. And I started this process of forgiving my father. And that day, that night, I made the conscious decision that I would forgive my father. Without an apology, without an explanation, without even knowing why he wasn't there. I made the decision that day that I wanted to walk in freedom. And because I wanted to walk in freedom, the one thing that I needed to do was to forgive the person that had hurt me the worst to the core of my soul. So I forgave him. And y'all, for the first time in my life, now I'm from Detroit, but I ain't never been to jail. Ain't trying to go to jail. Don't even want to ride past the scene of jail, okay? Get nervous when I see blue, red lights, green, any lights behind me, okay? I'm an upstanding citizen. Only stuff a couple tickets. Other than that, I'm good. But for the first time in my life that night, I wept for weeks because I felt like I had been released from prison. I felt like part of my life that had been held up for many, 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 many years was finally free because I decided to forgive my father who had hurt me the most. But you know, you would think that that was the end of that story. You would think that that was the end of my story in forgiveness. But in fact, it was just really the beginning of me learning to forgive my father. I remember after that portion, I went on in life and I was trying to forgive him, and there had been some correspondence and things were going good, but I had really figured out that every time I had forgiven him, I had opened the opportunity for him to wound me again. And that's the risk that we take with forgiveness. The opportunity to still wound is still there. And so I had to love my father without letting him get close enough to wound me. So I remember as I grew up, as I got a little bit of ministry under my belt, as I experienced some more things, I ended up in Goshen, Indiana, Amish country. If you've ever been there, great place to visit, not a great place to live. Bless them, Lord. If you like donuts and good Amish chicken and fried chicken, all that, go there. It's a good place to visit on a Friday. Make sure you're back for your pastor on Sunday, okay? Make sure you're back on Sunday, okay? And so I was dealing with a lot of insecurity. I was dealing with so many things, and even at that time, this was just a few years ago, even as a 40-year-old man, although I had forgiven my father, I still had wounds that I hadn't dealt with. And I had reacted to every single person in my life as if they're the ones that hurt me. I was still doing it. Even though I had started the process of forgiving my father. And I remember I was driving back to Goshen, and I decided to put in a podcast. It was a message. And the message was called Rejoicing in Rejection. And that message, that 35-minute message, began to speak to me. And I realized I had felt so rejected from my father. I realized I had felt so kicked to the curb. Even though I had forgiven him, I had realized there was still part of my heart that had held him captive. And that day on the side of the road, I ended up having to pull over because that sermon began to speak to me in such a way that finally, in 40 years of my life, it was finally time for me to really, really forgive my father and to let him go, to understand maybe he didn't have a good dad. Maybe he didn't have a good example. I have to forgive my father, not because of what I know, but I have to forgive him from the benefit of the doubt. Maybe he didn't know what it was like to be a good father. Maybe he wasn't ready. Maybe he didn't have what it takes. Maybe God knew all of it. I know he did. God knew all along exactly what I needed, and he needed me to share my story. And so everything that I had went through up until that point was on purpose. So that day I forgave my father, and something happened over my life on the side of the road that day that I can never, ever really explain to you, but in such a real way for the first time in my life, it's like God came and he sat with me. And he began to heal my heart of some very dark and some very deep stuff on the inside of my heart. He began to heal me from things that I didn't really even know about. And there's a story in Luke chapter 7, and it's about a woman. And when she enters this room and in this town, like everybody knows about her business. Everybody knows her story. They all know what she has been through. So we're gonna read it really quick right here this morning. It goes like this. It's coming. It's coming. I know it is. It's coming. There you go. One of the Pharisees asked him to eat with him, and he went into the Pharisee's house, and he reclined at the table. And behold, a woman of the city who was a sinner. When she learned that he was reclining at the table in the Pharisee's house, she bought an alabaster flask of ointment, and standing behind him at his feet weeping, she began to wet his feet with her tears and wiped them with the hair of her head and kissed his feet and anointed them with the ointment. Now when the Pharisee who had invited him saw this, he said to himself, if this man were a prophet, he would have known who and what sort of woman it is who is touching him, for she is a sinner. I wonder how he knew. That's the pause, okay. And Jesus answering said to him, Simon, I have something to say to you. He answered, say it, teacher. A certain moneylender who had two debtors who owed 500 denarii and the other 50, when they could not pay, he canceled the debt of both. Now, which of them will he love more? Simon answered, the one I suppose for whom he canceled the larger debt. And he said to him, you have judged rightly. Then turning toward the woman, he said to Simon, you see this woman, I enter your house, you gave me no water for my feet, but you wet my feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair. You gave me no kiss, but from the time I came in, she has not ceased to kiss my feet. You did not anoint my head with oil, but she has anointed my feet with ointment. Therefore, I tell you, her sins, which are many, I'm in the same boat with her, are forgiven, for she loved much. But he who is forgiven little loves little. And that day, in the car with my father, this verse became a reality to me. You see, because I have been forgiven much, so I should love much. I have been forgiven much, so it is my opportunity, because God has forgiven me much. Who do I think that I am to hold my father in the prison of unforgiveness? This morning, forgiveness is not fair, but you have to do it. Why? Because every single one of us in this room has been forgiven much. And if you have been forgiven much, then it is your responsibility, it is our responsibility to forgive much. You know, it's always interesting to me that sometimes when we get in the thick of it, when we get hurt, when we get sinned against, that we don't want to forgive. But I remember 2,000 years ago reading the story about a holy God who sent his only son to a cross to die, to make a relationship right between us and him. Want to talk about forgiveness? Want to talk about unforgiveness? He sent his only son to be the sacrifice for a people that he didn't know was going to accept him, whether he accepted him or not. God forgave you and I. So who are we not to forgive those who have hurt us? I get it. We all got pain. I get it. We all got struggles. I get it. We've all been hurt. I get it. Nobody knows what they did. Nobody knows what they said. Listen, I get it. There are times as a second grader that I'm hiding under my bed from my cousins. I get it. There are times as a 35 or 40-year-old that I'm crying myself to sleep at night. Why? Because I still felt the very real rejection of my father. I get it. But I refuse to let unforgiveness steal another thing from me. I refuse to let unforgiveness rob another year. I refuse to let unforgiveness rob any more innocence from my life. So what about you this morning? What is your on the porch to midnight story? See, I can stand here and say with 100% confidence, I have absolutely forgiven my father, and I wish him good, and I wish him well. But what is your story this morning? You see, we've all been forgiven much, and to be forgiven much requires that we love much. So who do you need to forgive this morning? Who do you need to let walk free this morning? You see, I didn't realize, but me forgiving my father was more of a gift to him than anything ever was. Me forgiving my father was more of a gift to myself than it was for him. So who do you need to forgive this morning, friends? Who in your life do you need to drop the F-bomb on? Maybe there are some things that nobody else knows about. Maybe there's some hurt that nobody else knows about. Maybe you need to go home and make a phone call. Maybe you got to go write a letter. Maybe you got to reach out to somebody. But let today be the day that you begin the process to forgive. Now understand this. This is like my journey. I thought that I forgave and it was one and done. It's not the truth. You continually have to arrest those thoughts. You continue have to arrest the unforgiveness and say, no, God, this is the forgiveness I'm walking in. I'm going to walk in forgiveness. I'm going to allow this person to be set free. And then realize that I was actually the one who was captive. See, my father wasn't really captive. I held him captive in my mind. I held my cousins captive in my mind. I had all those people captive in my mind. But I was the one who was really captive. I was the one who was really imprisoned in my mind. That's why it felt like I was so free when I forgave. It's my prayer for you this morning that as I close, that every single one of us will walk in the freedom that forgiveness allows us to walk in. That this morning, that when you leave this place, maybe it's a text message, maybe it's a letter, maybe it's a phone call to drop the F-bomb on somebody, and whether or not they're sorry, or whether or not they receive it, or whether or not they acknowledge your pain, it is time to start the process. Why? Because you have been forgiven much. It is your responsibility to forgive and to love as you have been forgiven and as you have been loved. Will you pray with me this morning, Father?